For this skills demonstration, I want to introduce you to a set of components that provide constrained input. Specifically, we will look at date and time pickers, spinners, list pickers, and list views. These all allow the user to provide input, but only by selecting from a narrow set of information. Now, these components all work in a similar way. Instead of generating or entering their own input, users select data. After the selection is made, an event is fired that allows our program to react to the user's choice. Let's see this in action. Okay, so here I am in a fresh project. And over here in my palette, in my user interface drawer, I've got the components I was just mentioning. The date picker, the time picker, the spinner, the list view, and the list picker. They're all there. So let's take a look at the date picker. I'm going to drag one onto my screen, and I'm just going to change the name, the text of it to birthday. Okay. Now, the component has some inherent action to it. Let's take a look at it on our screen. If I touch the birthday, notice what it does is it creates a pop-up that allows me to select some information about a date. You've seen this kind of thing before. It's a fairly standard interface. Okay? So if it already has that action built in, what do I do with the blocks? Well, the thing that it reacts to is after a date has been set, it allows me to react to that. So suppose, for example, I just wanted to echo that back. I'm going to stick a label on here. Again, get rid of the text. And I'd like to put the date that they selected into this label. Let's go back to my block editor. So what I want to do is I want to set the text of this label to be the value that was selected by the date picker. That should be easy enough, right? We can find that as a property in my date picker object. However, there's not a single property, there's not a single property that captures the entire date. Instead, what you see is there are separate components for the different pieces of the date that I added. It breaks it up into the day, month, and year. Right? So if I want to display these in a label, I've got to take those pieces of text and join them together. Month, day, just need 3 of them. I add an extra string to my join. Month, day, and year. And so now when I come in here and I select my birthday, and I change the value here, it gives me the reaction, the results that I put in there. Now again, it's not a nicely formatted string, is it? It just took all those individual values, 7, 10, 2009, and shoved them together. If I wanted to format this nicely, I might do this, where I add month. I'm actually going to change this one. I want to actually, instead of showing just the month, I'd like to show the month in text. And then I want to add a space between the month and the day. And I want to add a comma between the day and year. So now, go out here, enter my birthday, I get a nicely formatted piece of text, nicely formatted version of my date. Okay, one more thing I want to show you about the date picker is by default, you'll notice it comes up with the current date. If I want to set that date from the start, I can do that, but not where you think. I would think that I could set that as a property here initially, but there's no property that holds that date value, unfortunately. So the way I have to do this is a little bit different. If I use my date picker, we can see one of the actions I can take on the date picker is to set the date to display, right? And I can give it some values in here. Let's see. I want to display 1962. It's 11. 3. Okay. So that will set the date for me. But where do I invoke that? How do I, see this fits in somewhere. Where does this fit in? And a good place to put this is when the date picker is initially touched. So this means whenever the user starts to touch the date picker to initiate a selection, we can set the date. Let's see this in action. So now if I touch this, we see that my initial date is set. All right, good. The time picker works almost the same way. I'm not going to run through that in specifics, but same kind of behavior as the date picker. So the next thing I'd like to show you is a spinner. And again, if I show you this, you'll probably immediately recognize it. It's got some text, and it's got a little downward pointing triangle, which invites me to press that and expand this to get some items to select. So where do I get the items to select from? Well, that's a property. Elements from string. And what it's looking for here is a comma-separated list. So I'm just going to type in cat, comma, dog, comma, fox. All right? And like the date picker, the spinner already has some built-in behavior. Let's see what that looks like. Notice that when I come in here, add some text has been replaced with cat. That's the first element in the list. And by default, that's the one that's going to show up. And if I press the component, notice what I get is a pop-up that has a set of radio buttons for me to select from. And when I choose one of those, it then changes the text property of that spinner to reflect the item that was selected. Just like the date picker, the spinner has the ability to raise an event after a selection has been made. And notice that I've got an extra little local variable here that tells me which item was selected. So what I can do is I can ask a simple question of which one was selected. If the selection, I'm going to compare the text of the selection to get the selection. If the selection is the same as cat, then what do I want to do? I want to set the text of the label. To some string. And I'll put an else clause in here. Otherwise, I'm just going to leave the label blank. So let's see this in action. So if I come in here now and I select an option, fox, nothing happens. If I select cat, I get my message. If I change the selection, my message goes away. So the list picker and the list view behave in a similar way to the spinner. The only difference really is the way that it manages the information, the way it presents the list to us. So the list picker, notice that I can put in some text for this guy. Favorite animal. Right? Unlike the spinner, the text that appears on the list picker is not part of the list. And I can put my elements in my list. Cat, dog, fox. And the way this behaves is instead of a pop-up list, it actually takes me to a second screen. And after I make my selection, it returns me back to the original screen. A list view, very similar, except instead of having the list presented on a separate screen or a pop-up, it displays it on the list itself. So cat, dog, fox, right, something like this. Now, the one thing I have noticed with the list view that's a little bit challenging is that on my screen, the whole list doesn't always show up. And this has to do with the height property of the list. You'd think that automatic it would make it the size of the list, but I think what's happening is App Inventor doesn't know the size of the list until it actually renders. And so it doesn't want to, it doesn't play nicely with automatic. So what I found I have to do when I'm working with list views is set the height of the list explicitly. And if I do that, then I can see my entire list displayed on the screen, and I can make a selection. Okay, so they behave in the same way as a spinner in that they both have the ability to process what happens after the user has made their selection. So now I think you have a good understanding, or a good introduction at least, to working with constrained input components on our interface.